So hey everyone, my name is Sin. I'm the art director at Kitfox Games. We're currently working on Moon Hunters, and today I'm going to do a little overview of my slides for this presentation I did at the Ottawa International Game Conference, the OIGC. So let's take a look at Pixel Revival, the art of Moon Hunters. So really we're going to start with the evolution of the art style. And then we'll talk a bit about the environment art, the watercolor aspect of the game, and lastly we'll talk about a couple of technical implementations of the game. So let's start with the evolution of the art style. So at first, these are the first couple of mock-ups for the game. This is from November 2013 when we were pitching to the Square Enix Collective. So you could see that at the time it was very much inspired by like a tile-based old school Zelda look. We were very much inspired by Zelda Four Swords at the time, and as we moved on to the collective palette phase, we knew that we needed to just kind of work more on the art style, make it more unique, right? So the characters are changing, the colors are changing here, and on the right, that's when we figured out that we wanted to the game to have a more like open feeling to it, a more atmospheric feeling. We didn't want to have like small dungeon. We didn't want it to be a dark dungeon crawling game. So in March 2014, we brought in GP, and he's an amazing pixel artist, and this is some of his work. And I got to learn a lot with him, and these are our pixel characters and as they evolved over time. So you can see there are 4 generations, and in the third generation, the third iteration, that's when we brought in GP. And you can really see how the color palette is changing, and we are controlling the values more. We also changed the character proportions so that they're more chibi looking, so that the hitbox for the character is a bit easier to guess for our players, because it is after all a top-down game. So you want it to be obvious, where your character would not get hit. So yeah, the main differences between the third and the fourth iteration is that in the fourth one, we tried to make the character look more top-down. And the way I collaborated with GP was fairly interesting. Is he would draw over my sprites and I would draw over his, and we'll go through kind of cycles like that until we find something that we're both satisfied with. And so yeah, the fourth version, that's what we are at now. That's what the characters look like now. We also went back to do some research, right? So we have this mood board for ancient Assyria, for our ancient Mesopotamia theme. We wanted to look for something for historical period that is not like this gothic European medieval fantasy thing that you see everywhere in every game. We wanted something that's a bit different, a bit more unique. So we collected a whole bunch of images and made this mood board of ancient Mesopotamia. You can really see there's a lot of very interesting costume and mythology and architecture, just a really distinctive shape language that I will draw inspiration from to design all the character and the environment in Moon Hunters. In the end, it's going to help make the game more unique, look more unique. And same for the fantasy aspect of the game, right? I wanted fantasy illustrations that are a bit more weird than cool, perhaps. So the 3 artists that I looked at for our dark fantasy themes are Mobius. In the middle, it's Wayne Barlow, and on the right, it's Amano. He did a bunch of watercolor concepts for Final Fantasy, the earlier Final Fantasies. And that's something that really inspired me to create a watercolor look, watercolor style concept art for the game. And now let's talk a bit about the environment art, the environment design. The other thing that was important for the art direction for the environment was value control. So on the left, it's an illustration by Gustave Doré, who was an amazing French printmaker, and his control of values is really amazing, right? You can really see where the highest point of contrast, the horseman and against the background, that's where the highest contrast of black and white is. And that's what the focal area of the image is. And on the right, we have a screenshot of Ori and the Blind Forest. And what's cool about this is that all the platforming elements comes to the foreground because it's a dark shape against a mid-tone and light background. So that's the whole game is very easy to read, even though it's super detailed and everything's moving. With value control, you can really control, make it separate the planes of the gameplay more easily. And Ori is also a completely white, pure white character, so that it can stand out against any background, any images, so that the contrast is there. And I tried to incorporate a bit of that in Moonhunters. This is a screenshot from the jungle biome, the jungle village. And you can see that I very carefully control the environmental asset to have a very tight value range. It doesn't go very dark, and it doesn't go very bright. The lightest spots and the darkest spots are always on the characters, so that they always have a higher contrast compared to the background. Right? The ground itself is also lighter gray than all the structures, because the structures, they need to stand out against the ground, because those are the obstacles. You need to show the player where they can walk and where they cannot, simply by using values. Here another example, when enemies are hit, they actually flash white, and that just increases their contrast against the background. And we control all the ground texture in the game to be within a certain gray range, so that we're sure that the background is always a certain grayness, so that when we have like combat effects and when enemies they're flashing white, it will always stand out against any kind of background. Because it's important for the player to be able to read where the enemies are in a lush environment. And using value contrast is a great tool for that. You can see here that the enemies all stand out against the background because their value range are wider than that of the background. It doesn't mean that you can't have details, right? In the lower value range areas, there's still details in the grass, right? But I'm using very subtle shift of grays to create those details, so that the value range is still restricted. Same with the foliage. It's all within this very tight value range. And as for colors, what was important for me was to create a very distinctive color palette for each biome. It's almost like a color key, in animation films. So every biome has a key color, right? So for the forest, for example, it's green. For the mountain, it's this blue color. And for the colors to harmonize together, any color that is not the key color is kind of more subdued. And I tried to incorporate like a secondary hue to add like an accent color to the key color. For the forest, for example, the key color is green, but we do have these little touches of pink here to kind of just give it a bit of an accent, give it some interest. And you can see that all the other colors, like this grayish tree bark color, it's very subdued, right? If you look at the palette here, even the rocks, it's a very greenish gray, so that everything can tie in together. And the pink is not very saturated, so that again, it's not too far away from the key color, so that there is a coherent atmosphere in the color scheme. The other thing that was important for me when picking the colors is to not just go up and down in values when you go up and down in colors, right? So the lighter color in the bushes is slightly more yellowish than the midtone, which is more greenish. And having that variation in color temperature, like saturation and hue, as well as value, is going to make it look more interesting. Now let's talk a bit more about the lighting tech in Moonhunters. So we use a dynamic lighting system by using a plugin called 2D VLS. The way it works is in Unity, we'll have to define a collider that defines the part of the sprite that is touching the ground. And from that collider, it's going to raycast and create a shadow from there. Right? And usually the light is attached on the player, so that it creates these interesting shapes. And the cool thing with this collider is that we can also use it as an obstacle collider. So a lot of the time, the collider is already there. So, now we're going to talk a bit more about the lighting system, the day and night cycle. Really, we're taking the same map as a daytime map, but we're varying the elements that spawn during nighttime versus daytime. and we'll apply certain lighting techniques to create the feeling that it's during nighttime. So the first thing, of course, it's the shadow casting from the character. During daytime, the shadow is a baked-in sprite or or diagonal gradient that's attached to every single obstacle. But during nighttime, we disable that baked-in shadow. Instead, we cast shadow from the player character and from lights. So that will be the first step, casting shadows. The second step will be decreasing the ambient light. So during daytime, the ambient light is just white. But at nighttime, we give it a sort of this blue tint so that everything is darkened. But we bring the light back with a vignette type of light on the camera itself. So we have a vignette cookie, a light cookie that we attach to the camera light. So that it darkens the edges and brightens the center, because we don't want necessarily the night areas to be super obscured, right? We want it to give you a very distinctive feeling compared to the daytime, but gameplay-wise, we don't want it to be more difficult, not necessarily. Character lights, then, it's point light that's on the character sprite, and with a radial cookie, so it's like a kind of a circle soft light, and that's the last step of creating our nighttime lighting. And the great thing with this is that we don't need to do much to the sprites themselves. I don't need to recolor the sprites to create a night version of them. So we can easily have a nighttime version of every single biome. Now I'm going to talk about the procedural generation. I'm not going to go too much into detail about the tech part of it, but I'll talk about the art. So the procedural generation, the walls are created using circle packing or square packing in this case, I guess. So we have pre-made big square chunks that we call them. It's one single sprite, and they have a collider around them, and we kind of place them organically this way to have a variation of shapes, and so it doesn't feel like it's tiled, right? Because in classical 8-bit games, it's usually just like a tiled sprite that creates the wall in the forest, for example. But we wanted something more organic because we can afford it. It's not a memory issue these days anymore. So for the grounds, we do actually use a tiled system. But the tiles are huge, right? Compared to the player character, these tiles are massive. So that's, during gameplay, you only see about 2.5 ground tiles at a time. So that's the repeated nature of tiled assets is not going to be obvious. It's still going to look fairly organic. And we don't really conform to a grid system in that way, except for the ground tile. All the other elements in the game are placed kind of organically. As for the blocking chunks, these are the blocking chunks that creates the wall, around each node in the procedural generation. And these chunks are made of 6 base images, base assets. And I will mix and match them to create a variety of big, medium, and small blocking sprites. And this is a way for me to work modularly, right, to create a variety and a large number of assets from a very small amount of work. That way allows me to create more assets in lesser time and also have a coherent shape language. Because when you repeat certain assets and certain shapes within a certain biome, it reinforces and unifies the shapes. Because, if you're in the same part of the world, within the same area, the geology of that area won't change too much because it's, everything should be coherent together. Now for the watercolor part, our character concepts have this kind of watercolor look. At first, they were more of an ink line drawing with one single color, but we figured out we could probably do a bit more with the characters. So I went back to the drawing board and actually did these traditional physical watercolor concepts. And I think the team, we all fell in love with the look of it. And the problem was doing it by hand traditionally would take a bit too much time, especially since we're going to have a lot of character portraits with different expressions. So here are some more watercolors. So the idea was to try to replicate this look, this traditional look in Photoshop. And there's several elements. in here, one of them is an ink brush black line drawing. The other one is having the kind of the soft bleeding effect, you know, of watercolor. And thirdly, it's having the paper texture. So to replicate these are the current character designs, current marketing art of the 4 main characters. We have 2 more. But the process goes like this, right? There are 3 main brushes that I use. The first one is an ink brush. The second one is a watercolor brush. Wet edges is really important. That's the most important part for this brush, for the watercolor brush, because it creates that dark line around each of your stroke. Because that's kind of what happens with watercolor, right? Especially if there's a lot of water, when it dries, it creates this kind of harder outline around every one of your strokes. But to create the wet and wet watercolor bleeding effect, I use a smudge tool. So it's not a brush tool, it's hidden somewhere behind like the blur tool. And with that, with these specific settings, you have to take a brush that's very simple, put it on scattering, and have a fairly low strength, like about maybe 5 to 10% strength. You can use that to kind of smear colors together. Right, so here's a little example. On the left, it's with the ink lines, the watercolor washes, and using the smudge tool to blend. Then we use a watercolor filter. So after all the drawing is done, that's when we kind of add in the texture and the filters. It might be a bit subtle here, but what it really does, the watercolor filter, I have it at very low settings, is that it reinforces the dark edges around your strokes, right? It makes it look more watercolory. And lastly, you add a bit of paper texture. Paper texture, I set it both on multiply and overlay so that it affects both the lights and the darks of the image. Right. So here's an example of the character portraits, the digital watercolor portraits in action in the game. Right. And we have already almost like 100 of them at this point, and there's going to be more. And each one have, depending on their story arc, they will have different expressions. And working digitally allows me to reuse parts of the drawings that I've done before to accelerate the process of creating portraits. We also have these sort of more textural watercolor looking illustrations for the camping scenes, the camping activities. These are a bit like the visual novel part of the game, right? Each activity has a certain result, and it changes for the character. So the way we create all these illustrations, one for each playable character, right, is that we kind of reuse the same background. So again, it makes it a bit faster because there are 3 different outcomes per activity. And right now we have 5 activities and several biomes with different activities in them. So, you know, you can imagine already like 5 times 4 times 3 is going to be a lot of illustrations for one biome. So the way I try to work around that problem of having too much to do is to work modularly again. The way I would do this is that I take the ink drawing that I've already done before and that I'm doing as I create more and more scenes. I'm taking bits and pieces of these ink drawings, just a line from different characters. So most of these are from the initial concepts of the characters, and I'll just cut them up into pieces and kind of use it as a collage, you know, and then morph it almost like a puppet to kind of fit each pieces into the pose that I need for the scene. And then I will do a pass to kind of redraw the line to connect things properly and apply the color after that. It really makes it quite faster, and I feel like the quality is roughly the same than compared to redrawing the same character in different poses every single time, you know. Now let's do a little technical breakdown of how we implemented Baba Yaga here. Baba Yaga is this kind of this witch house that flies away. It has chicken feet, and there are several systems at work here. Let's break it down. So first, the house itself, we separated the roof from the house itself in the shadow so that we can using the animator and just normal tween interpolation animation to just rotate it and move it. But for the feet, we have a sprite animation, like frame-by-frame hand-drawn animation with a sprite sheet right here. And we combine it all together in engine using the animation system. And on top, behind all that, there is a leaf particle generator system here. And what that does, it's also colliding with a 3D plane, so that it feels like the leaves are falling on the ground and actually falling on the ground, going into contact with the ground, and disappearing when it touches the ground. So in this timeline, it's actually pretty great. You can affect almost anything that's exposed in the inspector within the prefab that has the animation. So as an artist, I can do a lot here. It's very flexible. It's a grid system. I can change, for example, I can trigger the particle at a certain point in the animation without any code really, by just ticking a checkbox within the animation timeline. Here, let's take a look at the Blood Witch beam effect. The beam itself is a very simple scrolling unlit texture. So it's just this texture that's repeated, that's tileable, and that keeps scrolling. And to mask, the texture, because the beginning and the end edges of it is a perfect, square, we're using particles. So at the beginning of it, we have this particle, the start particle, and whenever it hits something, and at the end of the beam, we have this kind of fire particle. It's, I think, supposed to be blood, but yeah, these two particles helps hide the texture, the edges of the texture. Yeah, and that's it for the presentation. I hope you learned something, and hope maybe it was entertaining or interesting. There are definitely other techniques I want to explore from Moon Hunters. We actually use a bit of 3D and rigging to create the grass in the title sequence. Maybe we'll talk about that in the next update.